Hello, everyone. How are we doing? Welcome to the WSET's Wine Explorer Drink Wine Day webinar. It's just people coming into the webinar now, so we'll get started very shortly. If you are drinking anything nice, please share it in the chat. I say it's 5 o'clock somewhere, but it's almost 5 o'clock here. So yeah, if you've got anything nice, please share what you're having with your other participants. So we're going to get started very soon. Firstly, a brief word about the WSET, the Wine and Spirit Education Trust. We are the world's leading provider of qualifications and courses in wines, spirits, and sakes. And we've been doing that for over 50 years. We have qualifications being taught in over 70 countries and 15 languages. So hopefully wherever you are, you're able to take one of our fantastic courses. Just a note that the webinar is being recorded and will be available to watch later via the WSET Global Events Hub on YouTube. And importantly, if you have any questions, and I highly encourage questions, please put them in the Q&A box, not in the chat, and I will get to them as we go. We'll also have some time at the end for questions and answers. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Sam Povey, as you can see on the screen in front of you. And I am an educator at the WSET School London, where I teach levels 1 and levels 2. And before that, I spent a few years working in the wine industry in London, where I am based today. So without further ado, let's talk about what we'll be looking at this evening. So we're going to start off actually with a really brief history of wine itself and how we got to where we are today and what we're drinking today. We're then going to be looking at 3 different white grapes, so Riesling, Sauvignon Blanc, and Chardonnay, talking about the styles of wine that they produce and some notable regions where these grapes are planted and used to make wine. We're then going to look at 4 different black grape varieties: Pinot Noir, Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon, and Syrah, or as it's also sometimes known, Shiraz. And then, as I said, there'll be time for questions and answers. And thanks everyone for saying hello in the chat. I'm seeing people from the United States, Norway, Canada, the Netherlands, Taiwan, Sweden, Germany, a couple of people from London as well, which is fantastic. So welcome to you all. And as I said, if you have any questions at all during the next 40 or 50 minutes, please do put them in the questions and answers, and I will get to them as soon as possible. So let's get kicked off, and we're going to go back in time. Specifically, we're going to go back to the year 12,000 BC. And 12,000 BC or thereabouts is very important because it is the end of the last ice age. So prior to this, the Earth was extremely cold, and that really limited where humans could be and what they could do. But around 12,000 BC, the ice age ends, and that marks a really important point in human history. And about 2,000 years later, so in around 10,000 BC, we have what historians call the Neolithic Revolution. And what this is it's the first time that humans settle in one place. So we move from being hunter-gatherers to farmers for the very first time. So that was in 10,000 BC, which is about 12,000 years ago. And this is really important for wine as well, because when you're in one place, you can do lots of interesting things like build houses, farm fields, and of course, begin to plant the first vineyards. The first evidence we have of vineyards is quite a bit later though. So in the last 10 years or so, they found quite a lot of evidence of the first country to make wine, and that was Georgia in the Caucasus. So it's basically south of Russia, northeast of Turkey, and northwest of Armenia and Azerbaijan. And this is actually the excavation site where they found the very first evidence of winemaking. You can see the kind of the clay amphora there, and if you can make out, there's quite a lot of this kind of grape decorations on the side of it. And it's in these clay amphora that the very first wines were made. And that happened around about 5,800 BC, so just under 8,000 years ago. And that's how long, as far as we're aware, humans have been making wine. And then from the Caucasus in the Caucasus region, wine and grapevines moved south into the Fertile Crescent, so that's modern day Iran and Iraq, and to the Mediterranean coast to what is now Lebanon, Israel and Palestine. And it's from here that a civilization called the Phoenicians, who were a seafaring people, they took wine throughout the Mediterranean to Greece, to North Africa, to Italy, and to the south of France. And they really introduced wine to the European world, which has really made it one of its drinks of choice. And it's from there that we have all of the different styles of wine, some of the different styles of wine at least, that we're going to be talking about today. So that is a very, very brief history of the wines that you might be enjoying this evening anyway. So let's talk about some grape varieties. We're going to start off with Riesling, which is a personal favorite of mine. It's a very misunderstood grape variety. The first thing that makes Riesling really special is its acidity. So we've got these little bars that you'll see on the screen in front of you, and acidity is all the way at the top. So this is a really, really high acidity grape, and acidity is important because when you take a sip of wine, it's what makes your mouth water. And as a result, it creates this sense of freshness in a white wine. And acidity, Riesling always has very, very high levels of it. So it always gives this wonderful mouth-watering sensation, regardless of where your Riesling may be from. The other thing that people talk about when they talk about Riesling is sweetness. And this is why Riesling is so misunderstood. It has a reputation for creating wines that are very sweet. But the reality is that actually it can make absolutely fantastic dry wines as well, and everything in between. So the sweetness level really does depend on the style of wine that the winemaker wants to produce. So if you don't want to drink a sweet wine, you don't need to be put off Riesling because there are lots of options out there. And then the final thing to discuss when it comes to Riesling is what the flavors of the grape actually are, because every grape variety has its kind of signature flavors and aromas. So in the case of Riesling, it actually really depends on where the grape is grown and how ripe it gets. But for instance, Riesling can often have very floral aromas, so it can smell like things like white blossom and orange blossom, for example. It also has lots of citrus style aromas, so things like lime and lemon, often lemon zest, for example. And then when it's grown in warmer places or it's made with riper grapes, we tend to get riper flavors, so things like peach, for example. And the final flavor of Riesling, not that these are exhaustive, is that when you age it, it does some very interesting things. So I remember the very first wine tasting I ever went to back when I was at university was led by the poshest man I've ever met in my whole life. His name was Sebastian, and he was wearing a double-breasted suit, which I wasn't aware is a thing people still do, but alas. And he had this white wine, which I didn't know at the time, but was a Riesling, and he was basically swirling it around in his glass, and he said, "This is a wine that smells of petrol," or for those of you that are in the United States, gasoline. And I thought, no, it doesn't. Of course it doesn't. Wine doesn't smell like petrol, and why would you want it to smell like petrol? But when I was served a glass of the wine and I put my nose in, it did smell like petrol. So what Riesling does is when it ages, it will end up smelling like petrol, like if you're in a sort of a gas station or a petrol station, or it smells like rubber as well. If you buy a new pair of kind of trainers and open them up and smell the soles, that's what it smells like when it ages. And it's one of those really weird and wonderful things that you can get from a wine that you can't get from many other drinks. And most importantly, it smells absolutely incredible. So if you haven't tried aged Riesling, so Riesling with a couple of years of age, I would highly recommend looking out for it. So where do we find Riesling? Well, we find Riesling in lots of different places, but it's most well known for being planted in Germany. And very often you'll see it in places such as this on your screen. So this is the Mosel Valley. the wine regions in Germany are really based around the rivers, or the best wine regions are based around the rivers. And they're often planted on these incredibly steep slopes. And that's because in Germany, a climate that's quite cold, it can be difficult to ripen your grapes. So planting these grapes on slopes like the ones you can see on your screen is a way of ensuring that the grapes get ripe enough. So where are we in Germany? Well, a few different regions there. The Mosel, which is kind of the furthest north, and you can see how it basically just follows the river all the way along. And then we've also got the Rheingau, which is on the River Rhine, as the name suggests. And you can just about see there, but it's just on the north bank. And that means that all of its vineyards, they point south. And if you're in the northern hemisphere and you're pointing south, you're going to get the most sunlight. And the more sunlight there is, the riper the grapes are going to be, and therefore the better the quality of wine. If you really want a dry style of Riesling, because the Mosel and the Mosel in particular is quite famous for its sweeter styles. If you want a drier style, the Rheingau or the Pfalz, which is a little bit further to the south, are excellent places to go. If you want that style of nice, fresh acidity, but no sugar. So I'd highly, highly recommend looking out for these. And finally, if you go just a little bit further south over the border into France, you enter the wine region of Alsace. And if you have a look on that map there, Alsace and the Pfalz are really part of the same valley, and they have a very similar growing environment. And the result is an incredibly similar style of wine. So Alsatian Rieslings share a lot in common with the Rieslings from the Pfalz. They tend to be dry, and like all Rieslings, they're going to have a really wonderful high level of acidity. The final thing I'll say about Riesling is there's another country that's got quite a name for itself for producing this grape, and that's Australia, funnily enough. So right on the other side of the world. And again, they really specialize in dry styles of Riesling. So I would highly recommend giving Rieslings a try from places like the Clare Valley and the Eden Valley, which are just outside of Adelaide. Okay, so that was our first grape. Let's continue with arguably probably one of the most famous grape varieties in the world, and that's Sauvignon Blanc. And Sauvignon Blanc, I tend to find, is often people's first wine that they get really excited about. And it was certainly the case for me. So what does Sauvignon Blanc taste like? Well, firstly, like Riesling, it tends to have really high acidity. So if you like your wines very fresh, very mouth-watering, then Sauvignon Blanc is a really great grape variety to select. But the reason why people often get very excited about Sauvignon Blanc is because it has a very distinctive flavor. So it can often smell and taste like green fruit, such as apples, and citrus fruit like grapefruit. And it will also have some floral aromas as well. But the thing that really makes it quite distinctive is its herbaceousness. So Sauvignon Blanc really does smell green, for want of a better word. And in particular, people describe it as smelling like grass, asparagus, or even bell pepper. And it really does smell like you're making a stir fry. In particular, areas like New Zealand are really known for this herbaceous style. So let's have a quick look here. We're in New Zealand in this photo, in particular in Marlborough, which is at the north of the South Island of New Zealand. I think we've got a map here. There is Marlborough there on the map. It's incredibly beautiful, and it makes absolutely fantastic wines that have become world famous. And New Zealand is a relatively young winemaking country as well. One of the things that makes Marlborough Sauvignon Blancs, or as they sometimes refer to it, savvy bees, very unique, is the fact that it will often, in addition to having this really herbaceous flavor, will also smell like tropical fruit. So will smell like mangoes and pineapples, and in particular, passion fruit. So if you can imagine taking some bell pepper and taking a porn star martini, which has a lot of passion fruit in it, and kind of putting those two things into a blender, that's kind of what New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc tastes like. And it's very distinctive. It's very aromatic, and even if you have never done any kind of formal wine tasting before, if you've never done any of our courses before, you can really pick out these flavors with ease, and therefore it's very appealing to lots of first-time kind of wine drinkers or people getting into wine. If you guys have any questions, please just pop them into the Q&A, and I will happily answer them as we go. New Zealand as well makes many other different grape varieties, I should say, not just Sauvignon Blanc, but it's probably the nation's most iconic wine that it has produced. And it's one that you'll find pretty much in every country that sells wine on this planet. So if you haven't tried it, I would highly recommend doing so, because the wines are absolutely delicious. Okay, all right. So next up, Chardonnay. Chardonnay is a little bit like Riesling in that it's a misunderstood grape variety. Chardonnay is more than anything a little bit of a chameleon grape, in that it matches the place where it is grown. So when we plant Chardonnay in cool climates, so places in the north of the Northern Hemisphere, for example, they tend to be very different in how they taste from Chardonnay that's planted in very warm growing environments. And this is reflected often in the level of acidity that you'll get. So, for example, in the north of France, we have Chablis, and in Chablis, a white wine always made from Chardonnay, we have very high levels of acidity. But if you grow Chardonnay in a warmer place, you're going to get lower levels of acidity. And what that will do is it will make the wines taste a little bit richer and rounder and fuller bodied, a bit smoother, in other words. And that can be really nice as well. It's currently the month of February, and if you're in a country with a climate like the UK, it's quite cold at the moment. So don't necessarily want to have a white wine that's got lots and lots of acidity. Instead, having a wine with a little bit more richness and roundness can be really quite pleasant. And Chardonnay is a great option for that. In terms of how it tastes, as you can see here, there's lots of different flavors that Chardonnay can take on. And it really does depend on how ripe those grapes are. So if we're growing Chardonnay in a cool climate, you're going to get lots of apple and lemon flavors. But if you're growing it in a warm climate, you're going to see more kind of peach and pineapple. The final thing that Chardonnay can often taste like is vanilla, things like vanilla, smoke, cedar. And these come from its maturation in oak barrels. So many winemakers like to mature their wines, both white and red, in oak barrels. And what this does is it will directly impart flavor into those wines, which can often come in this form of kind of like a vanilla-y richness that are often very, very nice. Now, I've just got a question here from Elizabeth Black. Is there any Muller-Thurgau left in New Zealand, or has it all been grafted out? Now, Muller-Thurgau, for those of you, it's quite an obscure grape variety, predominantly grown in Germany. And the reason that they planted it in Germany was because it ripened really well in cool climates, in cool conditions. Elizabeth, I'm not entirely sure how much Muller-Thurgau is left in New Zealand. I suspect exceptionally little of it is left. I'm sure there is one or two vineyards here or there that have a little bit of the grape variety left. But nowadays, in terms of white grapes, you're going to see lots of Sauvignon Blanc, lots of Chardonnay, lots of Riesling, and even some Pinot Gris as well, instead of Muller-Thurgau. So thank you very much for your question. That's a really interesting one. And also gives us, reminds us that not everything is constant in wine. The grape varieties that countries plant and grow often change. I've got another question here about a suggestion for Chardonnay, so I'm going to answer that very soon. So let's talk about where we can find Chardonnay. And possibly the most famous region for Chardonnay is in France. And the picture you can see in front of you right now is Burgundy. So white Burgundies are almost always made from Chardonnay. And Burgundy is a bit of a weird wine region. because it's actually 3 wine regions in one. So you can see on your screens there, we've got a little outpost of Burgundy in the north. That's Chablis. And the question here from Chris Dever, can you suggest a Chardonnay that is crisp and not buttery? I would really recommend trying wines from Chablis. So they're always made with Chardonnay, but they are less likely to have that kind of buttery flavor that you see in other regions. And they will also be crisp. They'll also have that nice high level of refreshing acidity. So that's what I would highly recommend doing. Now, if you move a little bit further south, you can see that there's 2 more areas of Burgundy. The area in the middle is called the Côte d'Or, which means the golden slope. And that's the image that you can see on your screens there. I'll go back. Oops, I'll go back there. You've got lots of kind of very elegant kind of chateau in the countryside. And down here, where it's a little bit warmer, we tend to get a richer expression of this grape variety. So more stone fruit flavors, and you're more likely to have oak maturation as well. So more kind of vanilla richness. And then finally, right down in the south of Burgundy, we have an area here that's called the Mâconnais. And the Mâconnais is the warmest part of the Burgundy region, and you get the ripest fruit from down here. So as a result, we tend to see lots more kind of tropical fruit aromas. And the style of wine made down in the Mâconnais is quite similar to another country who's very famous for producing Chardonnay, and that is the United States. So in particular, in the United States, Oregon and California are 2 states that are very well known for producing Chardonnays. California, arguably the more famous, and they produce Chardonnay in a huge range of style and quality level. So you can get your nice, fruity, inexpensive, easygoing Chardonnays from California, and they'll just be labeled California. And they'll often be very rich and ripe and lots of tropical fruit flavors. But if you go to areas near the coast, it's significantly cooler. And as a result of that, you're going to get a style that's actually quite similar to the south of Burgundy. So I think that kind of Mâconnais balance of richness in the fruit with a little bit of freshness as well. And in fact, I've just seen Lana here from Sonoma County, and Sonoma County is one of those places that you want to go to get that style of high quality Chardonnay, which does taste like California. It tastes sunny, if that makes any sense at all. So it's got that kind of extra level of richness that Burgundy, white Burgundies don't always have. But if you really do like that style, white Burgundy, which is not cheap nowadays, I have to say, one of the places you can look for it is Oregon. So we're a bit further north here. It's quite a bit cooler than most of California. And it's said to produce a style of Chardonnay that is much more similar to what you would find in some parts of Burgundy, for instance. It's not cheap, to be honest with you, but it is usually less expensive than similar quality levels that you get in the more famous region of Burgundy. So that was an overview of 3 white grape varieties, only 3, and in reality there are hundreds, indeed thousands of grapes out there, but a very large proportion of the world's wine is made from just these 3 grape varieties. And with good reason, they produce absolutely fantastic styles of wine. So if anyone has a favorite of those 3, please say so in the chat. And again, if you have any questions, pop it in the Q&A and I will be absolutely happy to answer it. But unless there are any questions, I think we'll move on, and we're going to move into the world of black grapes. Okay, so let's talk about black grape varieties. So black grape varieties are named as such because they have black skin. And that is really important when we're making red wine, because the color in a wine comes from the skin of the grapes. So we can't make a red wine from white grapes because the skin of those grapes doesn't have the color that would be needed to make a red wine. So instead we rely on black grapes. And we're going to start with a very popular black grape variety, and that is called Pinot Noir. And Pinot Noir is a grape variety that is actually really tricky to grow. It's quite kind of picky about where it likes to be planted. It can't be too hot, it can't be too cold, it can't be too wet, it can't be too dry, it can't be too cloudy, but it can't be too sunny either. It's really, really difficult to grow, particularly as our climate changes. However, when it is grown successfully, it makes absolutely delicious wines. And these red wines that it produces, they also have that nice high level of acidity that I've been banging on about with our white wines. That tends to produce a style that is nice and fresh, which can be absolutely lovely. And you get some styles of Pinot Noir that are so delicate that they actually are quite nice when they're slightly chilled. And one of the other reasons that many Pinot Noirs work when they're slightly chilled is because of this thing here, tannin. So tannin, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, is that drying, astringent sensation you get when you take a sip of red wine. And again, this is basically a chemical compound that comes from the skin of the grapes themselves. And tannins in lots of other things. So, for example, if you've ever made yourself a really, really strong pot of tea, you've left the tea bag in, it will be noticeably bitter and a little bit astringent. And that's because tea leaves have tannin in them as well. Dark chocolate is also very high in tannin, and that's why you'll get that kind of bitter sensation when you bite into a bar of really dark chocolate. But Pinot Noir actually has lower levels of tannin. It's quite delicate, quite gentle. And when you chill a wine, you make the tannin more obvious. So as a result, if you've got lower levels of tannin, you can chill the wine without making it overly bitter, which is very important. Matthew, I'm glad this meeting has you thinking about Riesling. Hope you can go out and find one very soon. Okay, so what does Pinot Noir taste like? Well, lots of red fruit. So things like strawberries and red cherries in particular. If the winemaker wants to, they might mature the wine in an oak barrel, and that's going to add a kind of vanilla-like aroma to the wine. And finally, when you take really high quality Pinot Noir and you age it and you mature it, you'll get some incredibly savory flavors that are described by kind of wine geeks in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways. So for example, really good quality old Pinot Noir is often said to smell like a forest floor. In other words, it smells a bit kind of dirty, a little bit damp, almost like decaying leaves, and genuinely can smell like mushrooms. And sometimes in addition to that, you'll often get a slightly kind of feral quality that is described as basically smelling like a farm. And I remember once that one of the first times I tried one of these really good Pinot Noirs, I went to a fantastic wine bar in London, really small place. And the person working there, the sommelier, was a really lovely American guy called Corey. And Corey came in and I'd not had a very good day. And he said, "Sam, how you doing?" And I was like, "Oh, Corey, as it goes, blah, blah, blah." And he said, "Don't worry, I've got just the thing for you. I've got a wine that smells of strawberries and poo." And you know what? It did. And you know what? It smelled amazing. It's like going to a farm shop and buying a punnet of strawberries. And it just has that slightly kind of savory kind of quality that makes it just a little bit more interesting. So where do we get Pinot Noir from? He says, moving on from his very weird description of wine. Well, again, back in Burgundy, red Burgundy is made entirely from Pinot Noir, and it produces some of the most sought after wines in the world. These really aren't cheap, but they are often absolutely fabulous. So particularly if you've got friends that are interested in wine, it's well worth splitting a bottle between you to divide the cost and trying it. And again, as I said, Burgundy, that region split into these sort of 3 different areas. But most Pinot Noir is made from that central region, the Côte d'Or, the Golden Slope. And there's lots of incredibly famous villages and vineyards that often have a name for themselves beyond just Burgundy. So, for example, Gevrey-Chambertin is a village that we find in Burgundy that is very well known for its Pinot Noirs. But if you'd like to drink Pinot Noir and you don't want to remortgage your house every time you buy a bottle, South Africa is a fantastic place to go to. And what you can see on your screens here is the Walker Bay. So right on the Western Cape, here we are, the Walker Bay. And it's very important that it's right on the coast because, as I said earlier, Pinot Noir doesn't like it when it's too hot. So growing it right on the coast, and you can see these vineyards are just on the other side from the sea, means that it's cool enough to make exceptionally good Pinot Noirs. Now, these tend to be a little bit fruitier than their counterparts in places like Burgundy, but they can be every bit as concentrated and complex. And they are often not half as expensive as what you would find in France. So again, would highly recommend, if you're a big fan of a grape variety, going to a country that's maybe a bit less well known for producing that wine, because often you'll be surprised by the quality that you can find in these places. And again, South Africa is really gaining a name for itself for producing not only high quality Pinot Noir, but Chardonnays and Sauvignon Blancs as well. And again, the Walker Bay, and in particular, a place called Hemel en Aarde, which in Afrikaans means heaven and earth because of how beautiful the valley is, are excellent places to go to get great value for money. And I can see Michael saying Hamilton Russell Vineyards, who kindly supplied the photo here from their website. They make absolutely fantastic Pinot Noirs. And I can see as well, Linda there saying that you can get great Pinot Noirs from places like the Willamette Valley, which is in Oregon. So back onto the North American side of things, where you can get really good Pinot Noir as well. So lots and lots of places to choose from, but I wanted to highlight South Africa because I think it's a region that has really does deserve a little bit more recognition. Okay. Right, moving on to Merlot. Merlot, an incredibly famous grape variety, and I bet that you know, everyone here on this call will have friends and family that are not particularly interested in wine, and that's absolutely fine. But I guarantee you, they all will have heard of Merlot. And Merlot is a grape variety that has a bad reputation and unfairly has a bad reputation. A great example of this is the 2004 Oscar-winning film Sideways, which is set in California, and it follows around basically a wine snob who's a failed writer, and he's going on a trip into wine country in California. It's played brilliantly by Paul Giamatti, and you know, he famously has a tantrum outside a restaurant because he's refusing to drink any wine made from Merlot because he thinks that it is not very good quality. But at the same time, his favorite wine, or the wine he has in his cellar that he's saving for a special occasion, is a bottle of Chateau Cheval Blanc, 1963. And that's a very famous producer from the French wine region of Bordeaux. And the joke that the writers have very cleverly snuck in there is that Chateau Cheval Blanc is made predominantly from the grape variety Merlot. So just a little hint that Paul Giamatti's character doesn't quite know as much about wine as he's letting on. So what can Merlot taste like? Well, it's an easygoing grape variety. It tends to have moderate levels of acidity and moderate levels of tannin. And that makes it very popular with winemakers who are looking to produce slightly inexpensive, easy drinking, early drinking red wines, but it can also be used to create incredibly concentrated and complex reds as well. In terms of how it tastes, depending on how ripe the grapes are, we can have lots of red fruit, so particularly things like plums, all the way through to riper flavors of black fruit, so things like blackberries and black plums as well, depending on how ripe the grape variety is. And again, the better examples tend to see some maturation in oak barrels. So you might have that sort of vanilla, cedar, smoky flavor to complement all of the fruit. And where do we find Merlot? Well, the most famous region is in France, and this area here, which is known as Bordeaux. So Bordeaux, an incredibly famous wine-making region where we see an awful lot of Merlot planted, really at all kind of levels of quality. So from everything through from something labeled as just generically Bordeaux to much more famous appellations, which are specific areas. So for example, Saint-Emilion and Pomerol. And these are places that make those truly world-class red wines. They're rich, they're ripe, they're surprisingly tannic, and they age incredibly well. And so Chateau, Cheval Blanc, 63, a great example of that. If you can get your hands on any of that for less than at least four figures a bottle. Nonetheless, you can get fantastic value for money, even in a famous region like Bordeaux. And one of the tips that I would give you to do this is to look for wine labeled as Cru Bourgeois. And Cru Bourgeois is a kind of category of wine producers who might not be the most famous, might not have the longest histories compared to some of the other chateaux in Bordeaux, but they do make incredible wine. And again, often for not nearly as much as the more famous producers and more famous sub-regions within Bordeaux. I'm seeing Paula here, currently viewing this with a nice Saint-Emilion. Excellent work, Paula. Luca Van Gaal has asked, what is the difference in Bordeaux between the left and right side of the river, the left bank and the right bank? And that is an excellent question, which I will come on to answering very shortly. But in order to answer it, we need to talk about another grape variety first. Oh, before we do, sorry, I'm going to shout out the country of Chile, which makes absolutely superb Merlot and has done so increasingly in the last 10 to 15 years. The quality that we are seeing out of Chile nowadays is increasing and increasing and increasing. And again, much like South Africa, it is not as well known, and its name doesn't yet quite carry the star power that it really should, which means for you guys at home, if you're buying wine from these places, you're getting really good value for money. You're being rewarded for being a little bit more adventurous. So I would, again, highly recommend looking out for deals from Chile. And Merlot is one of the grape varieties that they do exceptionally well. Merlot is not just a one-man band, though. Merlot has a friend, and that friend is Cabernet Sauvignon. And Merlot is very easygoing. It's very friendly. It's the sort of grape you bring along to a party because it can have a chat with anyone. But Cabernet Sauvignon is definitely not that. It has lots and lots of acidity, and it's very tough and tannic and difficult to get on with. But the result of that is a wine that ages incredibly well. Cabernet Sauvignon also has very distinct flavors, lots of black fruit. So often people describe it as tasting like black plums and black currant, for example, but also kind of like Sauvignon Blanc, a grape variety to which it is related. It has this distinct green character. So lots of bell pepper, mint flavors alongside it. Because it's really high in tannin, it is very popular for winemakers to mature the wine in oak barrels. And the reason that they will do this is not only to add vanilla-like flavors, but also to soften those tannins. Because when you age a wine in an oak barrel, you allow a very small amount of oxygen into that wine, and that will soften the tannins out a little bit, which is very important given how kind of tough Cabernet Sauvignon can be. But the other way that winemakers will lower the tannins is by blending in a little bit, or quite a lot even, of Merlot. So that's why I said they're kind of their friends, because you often see them going hand in hand. And the place that does that is Bordeaux, as I've mentioned. Now, to go back there to Luca's question, it's an excellent question, Luca. What's the difference between the left bank and the right bank? Now, this is quite a zoomed out photo, but sorry, map, but you might be able to see that there is this big body of water that penetrates inland. That's the Gironde estuary. And on the left-hand side, we have the left bank of the Gironde, and on the right-hand side, we have the right bank. Now, the crucial difference is which of those two grape varieties is most favored. So when we're in the left bank, you'll tend to see more Cabernet Sauvignon planted, and the wines that are produced are going to have a larger proportion of Cabernet Sauvignon in the blend, with the rest of it being grapes like Merlot. So as a result, these wines tend to have those distinctive herbal and herbaceous aromas and much more black fruit. And they also tend to have that trademark combination of lots of acidity and lots of tannin. They're very, very tough when they're young. They're not very nice when they're young, but when they've been aged for at least a few years, sometimes for even longer, they really open up and you can get a lot of kind of complexity out of them. On the other side of the bank, on the right bank, we tend to see lots more Merlot being planted here. And again, the blends that are produced are more Merlot dominant. So as a result, they tend to be a little bit lower in tannin, a little bit more kind of red fruited as well. But there is not necessarily any difference in quality. And both the right bank, where we have places like Saint-Emilion and Pomerol, produce exceptional quality wines, and the left bank, where we have places like Saint-Julien, Margaux, and Pauillac, also produce absolutely fantastic wines. And it's really, more than anything, a matter of personal taste, which you prefer. So one thing that could be really fun to do, if you've got a few friends that are interested in wine, is get them together, have one person bring a wine from the left bank and another a wine from the right bank, and taste them side by side, so you can get an idea of the differences between the two. A country that, again, is worth looking for Cabernet Sauvignon in is California, in particular, the place Napa Valley. Napa Valley is incredibly famous for making really high quality Cabernet Sauvignon. That's often a little bit richer and often fairly alcoholic as well, but you can also get surprising kind of elegance from these wines. I will say it's not particularly cheap. Now, California as a wine region was planted back in the 1850s, around about the time of the gold rush. And I recently went to a tasting with a producer called Bruce Cakebread Cellars, and he said that, back in the beginning of California, they used to sell their wine to gold miners. Now they sell it to tech entrepreneurs, and because of that, it's just more expensive than ever. But you can get really good value in Napa Valley as well. And finally, because we're getting towards the end of our time together, we are going to be looking at Syrah, or as it is sometimes also known as Shiraz. And this is a grape variety that has lots of very interesting savory aromas. So it tends to be black fruit in terms of its kind of primary fruity aromas, lots of kind of blackberries, black cherries, but it will also have lots of very kind of savory aromas to complement that. So for example, black pepper, for instance, but also when you age the wine, it can end up smelling quite leathery, quite a lot like olives, and even sometimes people describe it as the smelling of meat, of kind of cured meat, of sort of saucisson or salami, in the very best examples when they are matured. The level of tannin does vary, and that really depends on what the winemaker would like to produce. If they want to make a wine that's a little bit more easygoing, or they want to make a style that is more tannic. And for those really tannic styles, you're more likely to see oak maturation as well. Now, the most famous region for Syrah is the Northern Rhone Valley. So just up here, is the Northern Rhone Valley. It's an incredibly narrow valley, and you can see a picture of some of the vineyards. They're on these very steep slopes next to the River Rhone, and they're so steep, in fact, that they need to be terraced, which requires a hell of a lot of work to keep up. But the styles from the Northern Rhone tend to be of that more savory, more kind of elegant style, at least compared to the other region where we can find this grape, which is Australia. Australia, and particularly places like the Barossa Valley, which is again just outside of Adelaide, they produce a much riper, richer style of Barossa. And here we tend to get flavors less so of black pepper and more so of licorice and chocolate, for example. So they can be very, very full-bodied, powerful wines, but they have just as much kind of complexity as the styles from the Northern Rhone. And again, which you prefer is really just a matter of taste. So again, if you've got friends that are interested in wine, get them together, get someone to get a Syrah from France and someone to get a Syrah, or Shiraz, I should say, from Australia, and taste them side by side to see which you prefer, because they do taste very different. The one final thing I will say before we finish today, and I'll throw the floor open to questions. So again, if you have questions, get them in now, there's lots of kind of truths and half-truths around why it's called Syrah in France and why it's called Shiraz in Australia. And you'll often hear people say that the reason it's called Shiraz is because it's originally from the city of Shiraz in Iran. Now, that's a very neat explanation, but unfortunately it's untrue. So DNA analysis reveals that Syrah is indeed a native vine to France. And it was brought over to Australia in the mid-19th century, in the 1840s, roughly speaking, where it's been planted. And the reason why it's ended up being called Shiraz is because back in the 1840s, in France, they actually referred to it as Syrah. And at some point, someone had taken some cuttings of these Syrah vines, put them in a crate, and scrawled on the side Syrah. And that had gone halfway across the world. And when it had arrived in Australia, the combination of the word Syrah, the long journey, which must have damaged the crate, and the Antipodean accent has produced the word Shiraz over the years. So it's more an accident than any kind of reference to its ancient roots. So now you know, nothing to do with Shiraz in Iran, unfortunately, as fun as that would be. Exactly. So as Christopher is asking, it's something like Syrah, or in fact, as I'm just about to type here, it will be something like Syrah, like so. But it is a little bit of a funny backstory. Many of these grape varieties do have slightly strange backstories. So that is just about everything for today. Oh, here are some of the incredibly old vines that you can find in Australia. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. If there are any questions, please do pop them into the Q&A box. We've got about 10 minutes or so where I can answer any and all questions you have, even if that's about something that we haven't necessarily discussed during the webinar today. So I've got a question here. When we pick wines from different regions for a tasting, speaking of kind of a low to mid price level, how do we judge if it's representative of the region? The more we taste, the more we know. Absolutely, this is the tricky thing. It's very difficult to pick a single bottle that will be representative of the whole region. And of course, there are producers who make different styles even within a region. And that is very difficult. And yes, it is the fact that the more you taste, the more you know. And if I can suggest, going on to some kind of wine course, perhaps one provided by the WSET might be a good way of doing that. But I wouldn't be able to say that with any more objectivity. But yeah, definitely tasting more is a great way of acclimatizing yourself to what tends to be produced from the region. And if you can, if there are tastings being put on that focus on the region where you can taste many different wines in one sitting, that's a really great way of getting your head around what the range of styles produced in lots of different regions. Matt here is sitting down to enjoy a Côte de Rhône, which is a grape region, mainly made from the grape variety Grenache. What can you expect? Well, apart from potentially quite a nice red wine, I'm sure you can expect lots and lots of red fruit flavors, potentially quite high levels of alcohol, because Grenache tends to produce wine that's quite alcoholic. But I hope you enjoy it. Helena, is it possible we can have the PowerPoint of the pictures you shared today? So the webinar is being recorded, so you can go onto the WSET Global YouTube page, and that's where you'll find the PowerPoint. And Christopher, is there any good resource that will help us learn the intricacies of the left bank and right bank? Again, I would direct you to the WSET YouTube page, where there are lots of videos on just these topics exactly. So I hope that is helpful. Are there any other questions, everyone? Thank you all for being so so kind of enthusiastic, and I've been trying to do my best to keep up with the chat, but it's been absolutely popping off, which has been great to see. My colleague Rachel has just put a feedback poll up on the screen in front of you. So if you do have a moment to fill that in, that would be really, really helpful. But just another reminder that, again, this is being recorded, so you can find it on the YouTube page. You'll also be sent an email as well with a link to it. And if you follow that email, you'll also be able to find lots more lots of links to upcoming webinars, just like this one. Yes, so if you are interested, if you've had a good time this evening, I do hope that you can come along to some of the webinars in the future. And of course, if you do want to learn more about wine, I would highly recommend looking at the WSET Global's website, where you can find details of WSET courses near you. But without further ado, I'd just like to wish everyone a good morning, or a good afternoon, or a good evening, depending on where you are. And please enjoy your Drink Wine Day tomorrow. If you've already started, good on you, well done, getting a head start. And yes, have a lovely weekend, everyone, and hopefully see you at a webinar like this in the very near future. Thank you for joining.